Among all the names that evoke the horror of the 20th century, Auschwitz holds a central place. It was not only a concentration camp, it was the heart of a machinery designed to strip human beings of their dignity, their identity, and finally, their lives. For years, men, women, and children arrived in sealed wagons, unaware that their final destination was extermination. More than 1 million people died there, many without leaving a trace, others with a number tattooed as the only testimony of their existence. But behind each figure there were decisions. There were hands, there were faces, and there was a cold and bureaucratic logic that turned murder into routine. This is a journey through the darkest side of Auschwitz, a story that cannot be softened, that must not be forgotten, and that still today continues to shake us by the magnitude of the pain and the depth of the cruelty. The beginning of hell. On April 30th, 1940, Rudolf Höss achieved an ambitious aspiration. At the age of 39 and after 6 years of service in the SS, he was appointed commander of one of the first concentration camps established by the Nazis in the New Reich. That spring day, he arrived to take possession of the position in a small town located in what had been southwestern Poland 18 months earlier, before becoming part of Upper Silesia. Its name in Polish was Oswięcim and in German Auschwitz. Despite the promotion, the concentration camp Höss was to run did not yet exist. In fact, his first task was to oversee its construction from a series of dilapidated, insect-infested barracks that had belonged to the Polish army. The surrounding area could hardly have been more depressing. That land between the Sauer and Vistula rivers was monotonous and had a humid, unhealthy climate. On that first day, no one could have predicted that within 5 years that camp would become the scene of the greatest massacre the world has ever witnessed. The story of the chain of decisions that led to this transformation is one of the most terrible known to humanity, and it allows us to gain exceptional insight into how the Nazi state functioned. Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, and other Nazi leaders made decisions that led to the extermination of more than 1 million people at Auschwitz. However, the mentality of lower-ranking officials like Höss also played a fundamental role in the crime. Without the leadership abilities he demonstrated in the then unknown field of mass murder on such a colossal scale, Auschwitz would never have functioned as it did. In reality, there was hardly anything exceptional about Rudolf Höss. He was a man of average height, regular features, and dark hair. Several Polish prisoners from Auschwitz confirm this impression and remember him as a calm and moderate individual, identical to the many people we pass by daily in the street without even noticing their presence. His appearance, therefore, could not have been further from the conventional stereotype of the SS monster with a flushed face, making him an even more terrifying figure. His character and beliefs had been shaped by his reaction to what had happened during the previous 25 years of German history, the most turbulent period the country had ever known. The Auschwitz concentration camp is the synonym of the absolute evil that Nazism advocated. Jews and Roma were used as guinea pigs for the Nazis' diabolical experimentation, gassing more than 1 million people and killing by hunger, cold, exhaustion, or simply by loneliness and hopelessness. However, many prisoners resisted the total dehumanization of the camp by striving to maintain their dignity. Maintaining hygiene, writing, or drawing were acts that helped them survive. The events are recounted through the voices of those who survived the hell of Auschwitz, the unbearable silence after the murder of children, the barbarity of medical experimentation on thousands of men and women, or the struggle to survive in a camp of horror and death. Auschwitz, epicenter of the industry of death. Auschwitz is considered today the ultimate symbol of the Holocaust and Hitler's genocidal policy. Especially from 1942 onward, it became the epicenter of Nazi crimes, a unique place where the largest deportation camp of the Nazi concentration universe and the greatest extermination center in the history of the Third Reich converged. For all these reasons, Auschwitz has become synonymous with absolute evil. As mentioned earlier, the first experience of mass murder in a gas chamber took place there in September of 1941 with Soviet prisoners of war. It was there that Jews and Roma served as guinea pigs for the diabolical experiments carried out by Nazi doctors and nurses. More than 1 million human beings from 15 European countries were gassed, and more than 200,000 men, women, and children died of hunger, cold, disease, exhaustion, and brutality, or simply of loneliness and absolute despair. Even so, Auschwitz did not begin as a concentration camp, let alone an extermination camp. Located on the outskirts of the city of Oswiecim, the Polish name for Auschwitz, the camp was built in the 19th century to house immigrants from the province of Galicia, at that time one of the poorest in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who were trying to reach Berlin or Vienna. At that time, it consisted of brick dormitories for 3,000 workers and 90 wooden barracks to house more than 9,000 laborers, along with other structures such as a chapel, a theater, a hospital. The camp's population quickly surpassed that of Oswiecim, which had about 14,000 inhabitants, half of whom were Jews. The train station, a fact that would become very important in the future, was just over 1 kilometer away and connected the city via Krakow, with the railway corridor that went to Hamburg through Breslau and Berlin. At the end of the First World War, with the changes in borders, Oswiecim became part of Poland, and what had once been an immigration center became a military barracks where, until 1938, the base of the 21st Polish Cavalry Regiment was located. The invasion of Poland by Germany on September 1, 1939, followed by that of the Soviet Union on the 17th of the same month, as planned in the pact signed by Molotov and von Ribbentrop between the USSR and Germany, would change not only its fate, but that of what would later become the Auschwitz camp. Indeed, through their respective foreign ministers who gave the pact its name, the USSR and Germany had signed a non-aggression pact on August 19, 1939, which would allow Germany to attack Poland on September 1, 1939, without fearing any Soviet intervention. A secret clause was included in the pact that foresaw the division of Poland and Eastern Europe between Soviet and German spheres of influence. According to this plan, the Soviet army occupied and annexed eastern Poland in the autumn of 1939. The Nazis felt enormous contempt for the Poles. In a document sent to Hitler in May of 1940, Himmler stated that their destiny was to be an uneducated slave people. The non-German population of the Eastern Territories should not receive education beyond primary school. The goal of primary school will only be to teach simple arithmetic, such as counting up to 500 at most, writing their name and learning that it is God's will to obey the Germans, be honest, hard-working, and behave well. I consider it unnecessary for them to learn to read. In that document, which reflects with sinister clarity the Nazi racial ideology, Himmler goes further. Thus, Polish children between 6 and 10 years old whose blood was considered racially acceptable were taken from their families and sent to Germany to be educated far from their biological parents. The personal and family tragedy of those children did not concern Himmler. It fit perfectly within Nazi doctrine, which classified and ranked human beings based on their race and blood. German repression was exerted first and foremost on the Polish cultural and religious elites. Men and women were executed, others were imprisoned, and sent to concentration camps in the Reich. However, the prisons of Upper Silesia quickly became overcrowded, and in December of 1939, the Nazi police services embraced the idea of creating a quarantine camp in that area for Polish prisoners before transferring them to Germany. The choice fell on Oswiecim, that is, Auschwitz, 60 kilometers west of Krakow, a zone of Poland annexed to Germany whose facilities depended on the German army. Rudolf Höss, at that time the administrator of the Sachsenhausen camp, was tasked with verifying its viability, and he deemed the old facilities suitable, provided some renovations were made. Himmler approved his report and decided to create a concentration camp at the site, abandoning the initial idea of making it a temporary quarantine camp. Appointed commander of the new camp, Höss arrived in Auschwitz on May 1, 1940, accompanied by several SS members. In his memoirs he wrote, "The task I was entrusted with was not easy. It was a matter of transforming, in the shortest possible time, a camp whose buildings were well constructed but in a state of total degradation and infested with vermin into a complex capable of housing or processing 10,000 inmates. As soon as I arrived, the authorities in Breslau already wanted to know when I could receive the first transfers of prisoners." From his arrival in Auschwitz in May of 1940, Rudolf Höss created a vast shipyard to adapt the old facilities to the new needs. To the brick buildings, others were added, floors were extended, and the same facilities as in other concentration camps were built: the office of the Gestapo Political Command, kitchens, showers, hospital, a jail, a gallows, and a crematorium. Electrified barbed wire fences were erected, roads and streets were opened. Auschwitz was transformed into an immense fortified city. The first prisoners to arrive in Auschwitz on May 20th were 30 Germans imprisoned for common crimes, destined to serve as kapos, coming from the Sachsenhausen camp where they had been specially trained for that function, and whose role was to implement the brutal methods in force since 1933 in the German concentration camps. These received a registration number from 1 to 30. As German prisoners of the Reich with leadership roles, they were feared by the other detainees. This group of criminals and their assistants occupied a privileged place in the prisoner integration system and enjoyed the protection of the SS. As camp employees, they were exempt from manual labor and had the right of life and death over the detainees. They were better fed, wore leather boots and tailor-made clothes, in addition to other privileges. Wacek was one of them. A former criminal, he was a cruel tyrant. He forced the prisoners into sports sessions, during which they were made to jump, crawl, and lie down under a constant rain of beatings. When, exhausted and bloodied, they could no longer get up, Wacek beat them to death. The deaf, paralyzed, blind, or wounded met the same fate. The recalcitrant were subjected to special treatment before death: suspension by their hands tied, food deprivation in a dark cell. At the beginning of June 1940, 120 SS men arrived from the military garrison in Krakow and from the camps of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Flossenburg. Then, on the 14th of the same month, the day the Wehrmacht entered Paris, it was the turn of the first true prisoners, 728 Poles, students and soldiers, among whom there were some Jews. In general, these prisoners were suspected of belonging to the Polish resistance. Their first task would be to build the camp. However, they would not be enough. At Höss's request, the German mayor of the city of Oswiecim forced the local Jewish community to provide 300 workers. Once the labor issue was resolved, the matter of the materials needed for construction remained. Höss had solved the first obstacle, but he lacked the second. The solution he found could not have been simpler or more suited to the camp's ethics. Prisoners were forced to demolish houses that had previously belonged to Poles in order to seize bricks, wood, and other materials. Stealing, or in camp jargon, organizing, thus became a standard behavior. It was Höss himself who admitted he was obliged to quickly resolve the situation to obtain by lawful or unlawful means the gasoline needed to go into town and acquire by the same methods the pots and pans for the kitchens. As for the indispensable barbed wire, he had no other option but to steal the amount he urgently needed. The work of the prisoners was very hard and violent, and in July of that same year, the first crematorium was built by the German company Topf and Sons of Erfurt, intended to burn the bodies of the first dead. This crematorium began operation on August 15, 1940. In the Auschwitz camp, later called Auschwitz I, there was the central political command and the luxurious residence of Commander Höss, as well as the prisoners' barracks and various maintenance and supply facilities. It was protected by a double barbed wire fence 5 meters high, carrying high-voltage electric current and profusely illuminated at night by a line of spotlights. Every 20 or 30 meters, the fence was interrupted by watchtowers with powerful floodlights that lit the entire camp, atop which an SS guard with a machine gun on a tripod was stationed. A 3-meter-wide gravel strip separated the double fence along its entire length. Anyone caught trying to breach the wire would be immediately shot. On March 1, 1941, Himmler visited the camp for the first time and decided to expand it. The goal was to accommodate 30,000 more prisoners in Auschwitz itself and 100,000 in a new camp to be built, which would be Birkenau, also later called Auschwitz II, initially intended to house prisoners of war. The decision also had economic aims, to allow the largest group in the German chemical industry, IG Farben, to set up a factory nearby, in whose construction 10,000 detainees would be employed. Thus began the Birkenau construction project, 3 kilometers from the main camp, starting with the expulsion of the inhabitants of the local villages. Today, a memorial at the entrance of the camp recalls that in 1940 and 1941, the inhabitants of those villages were expelled by the German occupier, and that Birkenau was built in the space of the demolished buildings. Moreover, the camp owes its name to one of those villages, the village of Brzezinka or Birkenau in German, located in a birch forest, innocent trees that lent their beautiful name to the most foul of places. Birkenau, initially intended for Soviet prisoners of war, began to be effectively built on October 8, 1941. However, the Russian prisoners barely numbered 10,000, and their role was the construction of the camp. Starved, exhausted, and abused, they died by the hundreds. The architecture of Birkenau presupposed overcrowding and promiscuity from the beginning. The barracks, mostly wooden, contained 62 triple bunk beds, each shared by 4 to 6 prisoners. There was no intimacy or privacy possible, and no space to store even minimal belongings. The latrines were located outside the barracks and consisted of an endless series of closely spaced holes that emptied into a drainage ditch. Birkenau is the faithful mirror of the Nazi policy of humiliation and dehumanization of prisoners. In the end, Birkenau would occupy an area of 170 hectares, surrounded by 16 kilometers of barbed wire fencing. It would have 300 barracks, including accommodations, latrines, kitchens, and warehouses. Until 1945, Birkenau housed the vast majority of the prisoners of the Auschwitz complex, Jews, Poles, Germans, Roma, under infamous and inhumane living conditions. In addition to the overcrowding and promiscuity in the barracks where prisoners were crammed, the available water was insufficient for hygiene, and feet were always submerged in mud due to the lack of proper paths. On rainy days, there was no alternative, and they had to lie down in wet clothing. In Birkenau, there were also various structures prepared for the extermination of Jews. Simultaneously, a concentration camp and an immediate extermination center, Auschwitz and Birkenau would be the main construction of the final solution, especially from 1942 onward after the Wannsee Conference. The SS in Auschwitz, the men and the machine. One of the greatest perversities of the Nazi concentration camp system was the forced use of victims as their own executioners. Thus, in the camps exclusively dedicated to extermination, a handful of SS members was enough to fulfill the objective. It was the prisoners themselves who were obliged to ensure the functioning of the death machine. Auschwitz was, however, a complex of several camps with a dual function, which is why throughout its history the number of SS guards increased. According to the archives of the Auschwitz Museum, estimates indicate a number of 700 SS guards in 1941, increasing to 4,480 men and 71 women by mid-January of 1945, due to the needs of the final evacuation of the camp. But the total number who served at Auschwitz from 1940 to 1945 was much higher, between 8,000 and 8,200 male guards and 200 women. According to the same source, the vast majority of the guards had little education, only primary schooling. Only 5.5% had university studies, mostly doctors or architects who worked in the construction department of the various facilities. They were mostly of Catholic religion. Then came the Lutherans, and then the atheists. Among the SS members who belonged to the Nazi Party, the Lutherans constituted the largest group. Most of the SS guards were of German nationality, Reichsdeutsche, or otherwise Volksdeutsche. The number of the latter gradually increased, leading Höss to complain that thousands of guards hardly knew how to speak German. Female guards only began working in Auschwitz in 1942 with the creation of the women's prisoner camp, and also due to the increase in the recruitment of men for the combat front. Although they did not belong to the SS, which was an exclusively male organization, the candidates signed a contract with the unit responsible for the camps and were counted as members of the SS, being subject to the same disciplinary rules. Höss writes that despite very active propaganda by the women's organizations of the National Socialist Party, there were very few volunteers to serve in a concentration camp. Those who presented themselves voluntarily or coercively received a few weeks of training in Ravensbrück, after which they were left among the detainees. In a description that reflects a bit of misogyny, Höss states that they were in general of an extremely low moral level. Despite merciless punishments, they stole systematically and used the female prisoners as intermediaries. The long years of Nazi indoctrination and the influence of the German militarist culture, along with the morally degrading environment of the camp, led the SS guards to a progressive dehumanization, conditioning their behavior in an intolerable way, even from the point of view of the SS themselves. Two attitudes characterized that behavior: sadism and corruption. Beyond the hunger, the cold, the exhausting labor, the lack of hygiene, and the promiscuity inherent in the concentration universe conceived by Nazism, beyond the punishments for breaking discipline, the medical experiments on living human beings, and the gassing of victims, the guards engaged in other types of services on their own initiative. The consequences of sadism on the prisoners were irrelevant to the camp administration. In this regard, it took two initiatives: the creation of a brothel, which proved ineffective in curbing their perverse impulses, and more significantly, the replacement of the guards by the prisoners themselves in the enforcement of discipline, including beatings and other punishments. This last initiative had a profound impact on the prisoners, causing them immense anguish. The commander of Auschwitz himself confirms it. Those who were still capable of reacting felt an inexplicable pain at being treated like that by their own comrades. The brutality and perfidy of the guards had a much smaller effect on them than the cruelty of their fellow sufferers. Nothing disheartened them more than the feeling of absolute helplessness in the face of the moral tortures inflicted by the latter. Corruption proved to be a much more complicated problem for the Nazi administration to resolve. The SS sought to convey the image of being an unblemished organization. For Himmler, an SS man could not have an ideal and at the same time line his pockets, have relationships with Jewish women, or drown in alcohol in collective orgies. Therefore, in 1941, a special court of the SS and the police was created to combat corruption, directed by Judge Conrad Morgan. Morgan managed to carry out some investigations of high-ranking SS officials, especially in Auschwitz, where he traveled in mid-1943, alerted by the discovery of a personal package sent from the camp with 2 kilograms of gold from the victims' teeth. Corruption remained inescapable over the years, increasing as the end of the war and the demoralization with the prospect of Germany's defeat approached. It was widely exploited not only by the simple guards, but also by the highest ranks of the SS, although in these cases generally without criminal consequences. Moreover, the court only prosecuted overly powerful leaders as a last resort. Maximilian Grabner, Gerhard Palitsch, and Hans Aumeier, high-ranking SS officials at Auschwitz, were some of the leaders investigated by Morgan, but without consequences. Another was the very commander of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, accused of having impregnated a female prisoner. Höss was even interrogated, but he was too big a fish. The court was targeted with threats, and the case duly forgotten. On July 31, 1941, Göring tasked Heydrich, chief of Reich Security, by letter to initiate all necessary preparations from an organizational, practical and financial standpoint for a global solution to the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. And in August of the same year, Hitler declared, "I will not rest until we also draw the final consequences regarding the Jews." Both Göring's letter and Hitler's statement, followed by many others in the same vein, denote a decisive escalation in Nazi anti-Jewish rhetoric. From the autumn of 1941 onward, Hitler's discourse became increasingly clear and threatening. Indeed, parallel to the growing impotence of the German army to defeat the Soviets, rage and hatred against the Jews, an old and always blamed enemy, intensified, this time accused of acting against Germany under the Bolshevik uniform. Throughout the month of October, tirades were delivered that distilled growing hatred. On the 17th of that month, during a meal, Hitler stated that the prerequisite for any change is the elimination of the Jews, and on the 21st he warned, "By exterminating this pest, we will render a service to humanity that the German people cannot yet understand." In December, especially after the Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Germany, according to Hitler's words, declared war on the United States. Indeed, in that autumn of 1941, some of the main preparatory measures for systematic extermination were decided. The introduction on September 1st of the Yellow Star for all Jews over 6 years old, and on September 18th the mass deportations to the east. On December 6th, the gas vans of Chelmno, the first death camp, were operational, and their lethal capacity was 1,000 people per day. They would be followed by Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka as part of the so-called Action Reinhardt. The extermination campaign, initiated with the killings of Jews and Bolsheviks mainly by the Einsatzgruppen, was then systematically organized from the first half of 1942 through political administrative decisions ranging from the establishment of a unified command in Germany with clearly defined responsibilities, particularly with the Wannsee Conference, to negotiations with the authorities of the occupied countries. The goal was to establish an organized and effective system of deportation, selection, forced labor, and extermination. On May 18, 1942, an attack occurred in Berlin at the site of the anti-Soviet exhibition, The Soviet Paradise. And on the 27th of the same month, Heydrich was the target, as previously mentioned, of a bombing attack by the Czech resistance, ultimately dying on July 4th. In retaliation for this attack, the Germans razed the entire village of Lidice near Prague, where the resistance were supposedly hiding. All the men in the village were killed, the women deported to concentration camps, and most of the children sent to Chelmno and later gassed. Probably in the aftermath of these two attacks on July 3rd, 4th and 5th of 1942, a meeting was held between Hitler and Himmler aimed at accelerating the extermination program. It was also during this period that the decision was made to transform Auschwitz into the largest extermination center of the Reich. That same summer, Rudolf Höss was summoned by Hitler. In his statement, Höss claims, though uncertainly, that the meeting took place in the summer of 1941. But most historians believe that the Auschwitz commander was mistaken about the year and that, in reality, he received the summons in the summer of 1942, not in the summer of 1941. In truth, as we have just seen, the concrete decision to exterminate all the Jews of Europe was only made during the autumn of 1941. Höss writes, "It was in the summer of 1941 when I was suddenly summoned to Berlin by the Reichsführer SS through one of his adjutants. Contrary to his habits, he received me alone and declared the following: The Führer has given the order to proceed with the final solution of the Jewish question. We, the SS, are responsible for executing this order. The extermination centers already existing in the Eastern Zone lack the means to carry out the large-scale actions that are planned. Therefore, I have chosen Auschwitz for this purpose first, because of its favorable location in terms of transportation, and second, because the site intended for such an operation can easily be isolated and concealed in that region. A hard and arduous task awaits you, to which you must fully dedicate yourself and ignore the difficulties that lie ahead. The details will be communicated to you by Sturmbannführer Eichmann, who will meet with you shortly. The participating administrations will be informed by me at the necessary time. You must maintain total silence about this order, even with your hierarchical superiors. After your conversation with Eichmann, you will immediately send me the plans of the proposed facility. The Jews are the eternal enemies of the German people and must be exterminated. All Jews we can lay hands on must be annihilated without exception starting now during the war. If we do not succeed in destroying the biological foundations of Jewry today, the Jews will later annihilate the German people." Eichmann traveled to Auschwitz in August. Together with Höss, they discussed the plan they were going to implement, beginning with the extermination process. Eichmann explained that the only possible method was gas. The inclusion of women and children in the liquidation plan made the shooting method too costly for the SS carrying it out. After studying the different types of gas that had already been used in vans and in the extermination of the disabled, they agreed on the use of a more practical gas, Zyklon B. Who were the prisoners of Auschwitz? "Here live the dead," read an inscription engraved on a prisoner's barrack. In reality, in the universe of concentration camps created by the Nazis, the prisoners were an army of slaves in striped uniforms whose function was to work for their own destruction. In the diabolical cauldron of Auschwitz, the deportees were manipulated and conditioned by the Nazis, who forced them to collaborate in the execution of their own death. For the prisoners, the impact upon arrival at the camp was terrible. The sinister appearance of the barbed wire fences, the diabolical vision of flames rising from the crematoria, the nauseating smell of burning flesh and hair, all that accompanied by the brutality with which they were received, the violent and immediate separation from their relatives, the ignorance of what awaited them, turned the prisoners' arrival into a nameless nightmare. All the survivors speak in their memoirs of that terrible initial shock due to which, in the face of the deafening noise of the SS shouts and the threatening barking of the dogs, in the face of beatings and the blinding light of the spotlights, they remained stunned, brutalized, and unresponsive. Arrival at the camp represented a radical break, the crossing of a border, the entry into a totally unknown, unexpected, and unpredictable universe. After the initial selection, children, the elderly, and the sick or those deemed unfit for labor were placed in the line on the left and immediately killed in the gas chambers. The others were placed in the line on the right, and their end was postponed for a few months. It is said that among the 500 men, women, and children who arrived in a transfer to Auschwitz, only 96 men and 29 women were chosen for labor. The number selected for the right column depended not so much on their physical condition as on the momentary needs of the camp or the available space. These were then forced to walk to the main camp, Auschwitz I, or to Monowitz, Auschwitz III, where they were made to undress in front of one another. Then came disinfection, shaving of the entire body from head to toe, including the most intimate areas, showering and clothing distribution. Next, the prisoner was registered on a form with their personal data, which would later be sent to the political department of the camp and copied in 15 copies for the various sectors. Finally, a number was assigned that would replace their name throughout their stay in the camp. Except for the German prisoners of common crime transferred from other camps to serve as kapos, the first inmates were Polish males who would make up the largest contingent of Auschwitz prisoners until the beginning of 1942. Between 140,000 and 150,000 people, including some women, of whom nearly 74,000 lost their lives there. Most were politicals, detained for belonging to the nationalist or communist resistance, or civilians arrested in raids. They usually wore a red triangle with the initial P for their nationality sewn on their chest. There were also Jews under those circumstances, but they were detained individually for the same reasons. Generally, they knew they would remain in the camp until the end of the war, and although they were convinced of Germany's eventual defeat, they lived in fear of not surviving until then. Indeed, the progressive degradation of camp conditions, epidemics, increasing food shortages, overcrowding, these factors reduced the chances of survival. The risk of being denounced or discovered to belong to a resistance movement was also a real possibility. So much so that the different political groups fought fiercely among themselves. Despite everything, among the Poles, national solidarity was stronger than political differences, which allowed them to assume some privileged positions in the camp. As the war progressed, the number of political prisoners of other nationalities grew, especially Czechs, Slovaks, French, Dutch, and Belgians. In the center of the red triangle with which they were identified, the initial of the country indicated the nationality, except for the Germans. The reputation of the different Aryan national groups among the political prisoners varied. The Czechs were well regarded, the Russians were seen as distrustful and savage, and the Yugoslavs, especially the women, enjoyed high esteem for their people's brave fight against Nazism. In the clandestine organization of the women's camp, the French were the leaders. Despite the error inherent in any kind of generalization, it was common for national solidarity to prevail over ideology or religion, even among Jews. Nonetheless, the red triangle was not always synonymous with a spirit of solidarity or ethical behavior. The second group was made up of Russian prisoners of war. They arrived at Auschwitz in mid-1941 for the construction of the Birkenau camp. Their condition was already pitiful due to their prior stay in the Lambsdorff camp, from where they came on foot in a march that lasted weeks, with almost no food. Until 1942, they were confined to some blocks in Auschwitz and forming a separate camp, the labor camp for Russian prisoners of war. Almost all of them died due to exhausting work, hunger, mistreatment, or gassing. Huss himself confessed that the physical state of the Russians was so deplorable that they no longer showed any reaction. They wandered aimlessly with no expression on their faces. They hid in any corner to chew on anything edible they happened to find or to die in silence. The third group, which bore the green triangle, was composed of professional criminals, former prisoners, and repeat offenders. They frequently performed functions related to assigning other prisoners. The choice of murderers, thieves, traffickers, and sadists for this type of duty was not unrelated to the worldview that prevailed in the Nazi concentration camp universe: the eradication of all established moral precepts. For the Nazis, beating a detainee to death was not a crime. It was simply recorded that such and such number had died. The cause of death was entirely incidental. Himmler constantly insisted on the idea that compassion was a betrayal of SS ideals. Another group was composed of the asocials, identified by the black triangle, women involved in prostitution, mostly Germans, lesbians, and vagabonds. In the women's camp, it was not the Greens, that is, the criminals, who dominated, but the asocials, especially the prostitutes. Almost all German, they were usually block leaders. There were also some Polish women. Unlike the camps of Dachau and Sachsenhausen, where homosexuals and Jehovah's Witnesses were numerous, in Auschwitz they formed relatively small groups. Homosexuality in Germany was severely punished by the Nazi regime, and male homosexuals were considered enemies of the state, which explains their greater presence in the re-education camps created after 1933. From the beginning, homosexual prisoners had their own insignia, a pink triangle. Female homosexuality was not attributed the same importance. Lesbians were included in the asocial group and wore the same black triangle. From the Nazi point of view, women were mere reproducers in the service of multiplying the race, and their personal choices were completely irrelevant. It is estimated that in Germany around 50,000 homosexuals were arrested, and of these, between 10,000 and 15,000 died in the camps. And the last group of prisoners who passed through Auschwitz were mostly Jews. From 1942 onward, Jews constituted the main group of Auschwitz-Birkenau and the only one destined for total liquidation. They were marked by two yellow triangles forming the Star of David with the initial of their country of origin. The selection of those to be immediately killed was carried out by SS doctors on the arrival ramp at Birkenau, the Judenrampe, which began on July 4, 1942, with a transport of Slovaks and ended in November of 1944 with the final gassing of 500,000 Hungarians on the Bahnrampe, expressly built for that purpose. In general, the SS considered that Jews ceased to live the precise moment they descended from the wagons upon arrival at the camp. All humiliations, all violence by the SS and the kapos were thus legitimized. As already mentioned, around 1,100,000 Jews perished in Auschwitz-Birkenau, including hundreds of thousands of children. But what makes the murder of the Jews unique is not the number of victims, but the intent of the perpetrators. Only in the case of the Jews did the Nazis plan the physical elimination of every man, every woman, every child. All other previously mentioned groups were targets of Nazi terror, but only the Jews were destined to disappear from the face of the earth. Once again, it is the Auschwitz commander himself who confirms it in his memoirs. The hierarchical positioning of the triangles reflects the ideological priorities of the SS, which were often internalized by the prisoners themselves. This identification, often unconscious, made the color of the triangle a highly effective agent of social classification. The result was a stratification of the prisoners from top to bottom that ensured the effective functioning of the principle of divide and conquer, essential in the space of the Nazi concentration camps. The status attributed to triangle bearers sometimes differed from camp to camp and from period to period. Nonetheless, those generally at the top were the bearers of red and green triangles, that is, political prisoners and criminals. The lowest category in the hierarchy was always occupied by those who bore the yellow triangle, the Jews. Just above them were the bearers of black triangles, the asocials, and then the bearers of purple triangles, Jehovah's Witnesses, potentially in a better position. While common criminals were there for their crimes, German political prisoners for their opposition to the regime, and Aryan prisoners from other nationalities for more or less proven opposition to the German occupation, race was the only criterion for Jewish prisoners from all countries under Nazi rule, including the Roma. The most infamous medical experiments of Auschwitz. The practice of medicine in Hitler's Germany constitutes one of the darkest aspects of Holocaust history. The Nazis assigned doctors a central role in the extermination program. They not only actively participated in the so-called merciful death, that is, the T4 program, murdering people whom Nazism considered unworthy of living, but they were also the ones who, when victims arrived at concentration or extermination camps, selected who would die immediately and who would still contribute a little longer to the German war effort. It was also doctors who, despite being bound by oath to save human lives, carried out the most heinous pseudo-scientific experiments on children, women, and men to whom the right to life and physical integrity was simply denied. The adult euthanasia program also began in 1939. All persons with incapacitating conditions were murdered in gas chambers and burned with the complicity of the medical profession. Death certificates listed false diagnoses according to the age and previous symptoms of the victims. Finally, patients with minor deformities, moderately senile individuals, war amputees, difficult children, and other similar cases were also selected by doctors to be subjected to euthanasia. This Nazi program was responsible for the death of at least 70,000 people in Germany until 1941, later shifting toward the extermination of Jews, Roma, Poles, Russians, and Germans who opposed the Nazi regime. Between 1942 and 1945, approximately 70 medical research projects were carried out in Nazi camps, conducted by German universities and research institutes, which included numerous types of experiments on prisoners. Himmler showed great interest in this activity from the beginning. In 1943, eager to protect experimentation, he ordered that all experiments be subject to his prior approval. Himmler did not just facilitate them. He closely followed their development, studied the results, and even suggested some improvements. But above all, he protected the doctors, assuming responsibility for their actions, and did not hesitate to contradict potential critics, considering them traitors. Approximately 200 doctors were sent to the concentration camps. Their work involved directing the selections and participating in medical trials. Phenol injections directly into the heart or intravenously to prolong agony, typhus virus inoculations, eye injections to change color, sterilizations, castrations, subcutaneous injections causing painful tumors, experiments on muscle tissue transformations due to malnutrition. These were some of the pseudo-scientific tortures inflicted on men, women, and children, in total and absolute violation of the medical ethical code. Many experiments were intended to justify and apply racist theories through biology and promote the supremacy and multiplication of the Aryan race. Thus, for example, 40 Roma were subjected to experiments to prove they had different blood. 150 Jewish men and women murdered in Auschwitz were used so doctors could study the peculiarities of their skulls. As part of the racial struggle, experiments were also carried out on dwarfs and twins. Other trials aimed to develop survival mechanisms in extreme conditions of high altitude, freezing temperatures, or seawater absorption. Vaccines and medicines were also tested to combat contagious diseases, wounds, or inhalation of chemical gases. A series of experiments aimed to discover the fastest and most effective method of taking human life, from the complete sterilization of women to chloroform injections into victims' hearts and the use of Zyklon B gas. All these experiments, which involved unbearable suffering, were conducted on human beings and, evidently, against their will. Among all the SS doctors who worked at Auschwitz, one name left an indelible memory among the survivors: Josef Mengele, chief doctor of the camp, better known as the Butcher of Auschwitz, or even as the Angel of Death. From 1943 until the evacuation of the camp in January of 1945, he was responsible for the deaths of approximately 400,000 people. It was he whom the deportees encountered when they got off the wagons, directing the initial selection with a whip in hand. They would face him again in partial selections, when with a careless gesture of his index finger, he pointed to the victims while whistling an aria from Tosca. But in reality, Mengele, a doctor in medicine and philosophy, did not limit himself to selection. According to Dr. Miklos Niesli, who arrived at Auschwitz in May of 1944, deported from Hungary with a group of prisoners composed of 26 doctors, 6 pharmacists, and their respective relatives. As soon as the transports arrived, several guards walked along the lines of prisoners looking for twins and dwarfs. Some mothers, believing they would be treated better, handed them over without hesitation. They were unaware that they would soon die at Mengele's hands. That is why, as soon as he arrived, Mengele separated the dwarfs and twins on the ramp. With the same goal, he placed them in the line on the right and had them taken to the barrack of those who were not yet going to die, where they received good food and hygiene conditions to ensure that there was no chance of one of them falling ill and, consequently, dying separately. They had to die together and in good health. Convinced that he had been chosen to discover the cause of multiple births, Mengele would spend hours at the microscope and the dissection table with his coat and hands covered in blood, obsessively examining and comparing. The screams of the victims, the black smoke from the crematoria, the smell of burning flesh did not bother him. After each selection, Mengele returned to that human hell in whose environment he felt at home. Among wrongdoers and criminals, the most dangerous type is the criminal doctor, writes Niesli. The lives and deaths of hundreds of thousands of people were in his hands, and he did not hesitate to use his power according to his criminal vision of humanity. The testimony of Miklos Niesli, written in 1946, is exceptional. Appointed by Mengele as chief physician of the crematoria, Niesli was, as he himself states, an eyewitness and involuntary participant in the work of the Auschwitz crematoria, in whose flames more than 1 million human beings disappeared. Despite being a prisoner, Niesli's situation was far from that of the other detainees. Not only because his personal conditions in terms of food, clothing, and comfort in the camp were completely different, but especially because of the function he performed, dissecting the dead and identifying pathologies. Moreover, as the chief doctor of the crematoria, he depended exclusively on Mengele's direct orders, and so he came to live and work at the center of the Nazi extermination machine. In addition to his anatomical and laboratory work, Niesli was also responsible for the medical care of all SS personnel in the crematoria, about 120 men, and of the 860 prisoners of the Sonderkommando. He was allowed to circulate through the 4 crematoria from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. One day, Niesli received the medical records of 2 small twins in a coffin. In his accounts, he says, "I lifted the lid. Inside were 2 two-year-old twins. I ordered 2 of my men to place the bodies on the dissection table, which was located inside the crematoria. I opened the records and examined them. Thorough clinical analyses accompanied by X-rays, descriptions, and drawings that indicated the different characteristics of those 2 small beings from a scientific point of view. Only the pathological report was missing, and my job was to produce it. The twins had died at the same time and now lay side by side on the dissection table. They were the ones, or their little bodies, that were to solve the secret of reproduction of the race. To take a step forward in discovering the secret of multiplying the race of the superior beings destined to rule, that was the goal. In the future, every German mother should carry in her womb the greatest possible number of twins. The project, conceived by the theorists of the Third Reich, was utter madness, and those experiments were entrusted to Dr. Mengele, chief physician of Auschwitz KZ, the famous criminal doctor. The immediate objective was the production of pure Germans to replace the Czechs, the Hungarians, and the Poles, all condemned to destruction. The next day, while dissecting the bodies of 4 pairs of Roma twin children under 10 years old, Niesli made a discovery that horrified him. The 4 children had died from a chloroform injection to the heart, which caused immediate death by cardiac collapse. SS guards with their dogs stormed the barracks and forced everyone outside, making them form ranks. The next morning, all had already been turned into ashes. These remained piled in the crematorium yard, waiting to be collected. However, by Mengele's express order, the bodies of the 12 pairs of twins were not handed over to the flames. Before sending them to the gas chamber, Mengele had marked them with a special chalk. In that group were twins of various ages, from newborns to adolescents of 16 years. At that moment, writes Niesli, they lay on the floor of the corpse depot, bodies of dark-haired, dark-eyed children. The work of sorting them by pairs was exhausting. I had to be careful not to mix them because if anything happened that ruined the investigation of those rare specimens, it would be I who would pay with my life. After the dissection, Niesli handed over the bodies to the Sonderkommando members to be burned and preserved the organs of scientific interest for analysis and selection by Mengele. These were then sent to the Anthropological Institute in Berlin-Dahlem. In addition to the deaths by gas and chloroform injections to the heart, Niesli confirmed deaths by gunshot. One night, while still in the dissection room, he heard gunshots in the adjoining compartment, accompanied by piercing screams. He counted 70 shots, and when silence fell, he went to see what had happened. Niesli recalls, "It was a Dantesque scene. Before me lay the naked bodies of 70 women. Twisted, bathed in their own blood and that of others, they intertwined, forming a diabolical cluster. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness of the room, I discovered in horror that not all were dead. Some were still breathing, moving their arms and legs slowly. With glazed eyes, they tried to lift their bloodied heads. I lifted the heads of 2 or 3 who were still alive, and I realized that besides death by gas and chloroform injections, there was also a third way to kill, with a bullet to the back of the neck. Birkenau, Auschwitz II, and the final solution, from the wall of death to the gas chambers by the Sonderkommandos. As explained, the first experience of murder in a gas chamber was carried out at Auschwitz. The initiative to use Zyklon B gas came from SS Karl Fritzsch, who, during the work absence of the camp commander Rudolf Höss, made the decision himself. Later, he would boast of having been the inventor of exterminating prisoners with gas. However, the liquidation process had already been planned from the beginning, and the gassing of detainees was done in the camp prison, located in Block 11, whose windows were bricked up. It was primarily intended for men and women suspected of acts of resistance, preparation, or complicity in escape or contact with the outside world. Zyklon B gas was manufactured by the company Degesch, created in 1917. It was a powerful pesticide that contained 95% hydrogen cyanide, a percentage that later rose to almost 100%, which increased the lethal capacity of the product. A document from Dagesch indicates that between 1942 and 1943, the company delivered 27,434.5 kilograms of Zyklon B to all camps, of which 19,652.69 kilograms were for Auschwitz alone. According to the statements of Höss and members of the Sonderkommando, a much smaller amount of gas was enough to kill 1 million people in Auschwitz. On the first and second floors of Block 11, more than 100 prisoners were crammed into large cells. In the basement, in small cubicles without light, with such low ceilings that it was impossible to stand, the most dangerous inmates were confined. Philipp Müller, a prisoner for 3 years at Auschwitz, testifies, "The SS brought us to Block 11, whose entrance door was closed, unlike other blocks. SS Oberscharführer Plagge opened it and ordered us in. We went down a labyrinth of corridors that led to the cells and underground dungeons of the block. The silence was broken only by the jingling of his keys. Our jailer opened the barred door, whose lock creaked, and we entered the central corridor. We were overwhelmed by a suffocating stench. The darkened, oily floor of the corridor leading to the cells had whitewashed walls, and the light was blackened. The cell into which Maurice and I were pushed had no window or ventilation system. It measured about 3 by 3 meters. When the guard closed the iron door, the darkness was total. Every Saturday morning, the cells were cleaned. After a brief meeting to examine the detainees' reports, the commission, composed of a doctor and block chiefs, would go down to the basement led by the camp commander. The goal was to extract the prisoners sentenced to death. They were taken to the washrooms and forced to undress. As already mentioned, the indelible tattooing of numbers upon the prisoners' arrival at the camp only began in March of 1942. After the registration of those sentenced to death, they were taken to a brick wall that separated Block 11 from Block 10, to which a sort of black cloth was attached. Then the detainees were executed with a bullet to the back of the neck, facing the wall. Once dead, the corpses were collected by other prisoners who carried them on stretchers and deposited them in a corner before transporting them to the crematorium. In a cell of Block 11 was held the Franciscan priest Maximilian Kolbe. Born in 1894, he was imprisoned in February of 1941 and interned in the Pauiak prison in Warsaw. 3 months later, he was deported to Auschwitz, where he was assigned the number 16,670. After a prisoner from his block escaped, the SS decided in retaliation to randomly kill one in every 10 inmates from the block. Among them was a Polish worker named Franciszek Gajowniczek. Married and father of a son, the man lamented bitterly, "What will happen now to my wife and my son?" Kolbe heard Franciszek's crying and decided to save the worker's life by offering himself to take his place, which the SS accepted. Kolbe was murdered 2 weeks later with a phenol injection. Between 1943 and 1945, a group of Jewish prisoners, some Poles, and a few Soviet prisoners of war lived longer than any other detainees at the center of the catastrophe. They were part of the Sonderkommando, responsible for the most abominable of tasks, operating the extermination apparatus of Birkenau as part of the implementation of the final solution to the Jewish question. Nearly all of this commando, which was renewed cyclically, ended up being murdered by the camp SS. Their lifespan was approximately 4 months. At the end of that period, an SS company gathered the commando and machine-gunned all its members. Half an hour later, a new group designated to be the Sonderkommando arrived. They were forced to remove the clothes of their dead comrades, of whom soon nothing remained but ashes. The first task of each Sonderkommando was to burn their predecessors. Neasley recounts that during his medical visits, there was always someone unable to endure their functions who begged him for a fast and painless poison. The main role of the commando was to help the SS make people enter the dressing rooms, help them undress, and enter the gas chambers. Sometimes they themselves had to lift the lid of the openings through which the SS poured the Zyklon B. Until now, writes Shlomo Venezia, I had never said it before because it is difficult for me to admit that we had to open and close the lid once the gas was poured, but that is the truth. They then had to gather the clothing and personal belongings, remove the corpses from the gas chambers, cremate them in the crematorium ovens or burn them in the pits, and transport the ashes to bury or scatter them. Due to the intrinsic nature of the work they were forced to perform, they were at the core of the death machine, having access to the most hidden facts of mass extermination. Entering the Sonderkommando meant never leaving it again, like the builders of the tombs of the Egyptian pharaohs, cited by Heydrich, who boasted of being the originator of the creation of special commandos, destined to die precisely because of the knowledge they had access to. Hence, they lived completely isolated from the other prisoners with whom they were forbidden to communicate. In a way, they were invisible prisoners. The SS guaranteed the members of the Sonderkommando better living conditions than the rest of the prisoners in terms of food, lodging, and clothing. The intention was, on one hand, to maintain their physical condition, without which the cremation of thousands of corpses could not be carried out on schedule, and on the other hand, to corrupt them to ensure their cooperation. The Sonderkommando worked in 12-hour shifts at the pace of a day shift starting at 6 in the morning and a night shift starting at 6 in the evening. There were also other tasks related to the extermination actions. They assisted on the ramp when the wagons arrived and transported the corpses they found there to the crematoria. When the newly arrived group was small, people were executed directly with a bullet to the back of the neck and not with gas. The Sonderkommando was responsible for holding them during the execution and taking them to the crematorium. Another group of about 15 members of the commando had the function of cleaning and drying the hair already cut from the women. Others crushed with a wooden mallet the human bones that the fire had not been able to destroy in order to reduce them to powder. The Sonderkommando also destroyed books, identity documents, and other personal objects that the camp administration considered unimportant. The final task the few men who remained in the Sonderkommando were forced to carry out from November of 1944 was to erase the evidence of the crime. They demolished the walls of Crematorium 4, burned during the revolt of October of 1944, dismantled the ovens in Crematoria 2 and 3, opened holes in the walls to later destroy them with explosives, transported the ashes to the streams and flattened the ground of the pits where they had burned and buried corpses. Throughout all stages of their work, the Sonderkommando was strictly monitored and controlled by SS members with the help of the capos. They were required to behave in a way that would dispel the suspicions or doubts of those condemned to death. That is why they were usually recruited from the same transports destined for the gas chambers so they could speak the same language as the condemned. They were forced to hide from the victims the fate that awaited them and even to spread false information, at least in the presence of the SS. Sometimes the Sonderkommando prisoners secretly warned other detainees of the danger they were in, but when discovered, they were punished with a horrific death, usually being thrown alive into the ovens. Franciszek Piper, scientific director of the Auschwitz Museum, writes that members of the Special Commando were recruited without knowing the task they were to perform. In a deception maneuver, they were asked their profession and promised work in better conditions than the other detainees. But despite eating and sleeping better, all its members were repelled by the work they were forced to carry out and were fully aware that they were contributing to the acceleration of the extermination of their brothers. That is why, Piper continues, for all the prisoners of the Sonderkommando, this task first caused a psychological shock that later provoked depression and sometimes led to suicide. That was the case of Menachem Lichi from Greece, who on May 18, 1944, threw himself into the fire along with the corpse he was transporting. A German sergeant named Grinberg executed him with a bullet to the head to spare him the suffering. Shlomo Venezia, deported at the age of 21 from Thessaloniki to Auschwitz-Birkenau on April 11, 1944, also states, "There is nothing harder than leading people to death. The first 10 or 20 days I was in a constant state of shock from the enormity of the crime, then I stopped thinking. Every day I preferred to die, and yet every day I fought to survive." Despite the initial shock, a part of the detainees in the Special Commando ended up getting used to it, becoming indifferent to the fate of those whose deaths ensured their own lives. But for the majority, including some practicing Jews, their work was a constant torture that would only end with their own death. They suffered with the victims, often family and friends, and the feeling of guilt tormented them permanently because they knew they were accomplices, albeit forced, in the crime against men, women, and children, the vast majority of their own people. When they encountered relatives or acquaintances, the members of the Sonderkommando incinerated them separately, collected their ashes in individual cans, and inscribed the name of the deceased, the date of birth, and the date of their murder. Then they buried the cans and, whenever possible, prayed the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for mourning. Some of these men clearly saw that the bond that linked them to humanity was condemned, and that the only way out was rebellion. Also exposed to the process of gradual elimination, they were aware that they had extremely limited time. Thus, they conceived a plan unique in the history of the camp that led to a general uprising. Faced with successive delays imposed by the central resistance of the camp, they carried out a desperate revolt. More than 400 members of the Sonderkommando were killed, and the revolt did not manage to stop the extermination process, but it demonstrated that those men still retained within themselves the strength to say, "Enough." The last gassings in Birkenau, Auschwitz II. In the autumn of 1944, Mengele decided to liquidate Sector B1YC, where the Hungarian women were held. Every night, writes Miklos Niesli, 50 trucks transported the victims, 4,000 per night, to the crematoria. A Dantesque vision, those trucks in caravan with their headlights probing the darkness, each carrying a human load of 80 women who filled the air with their screams or who simply remained seated and silent, paralyzed by fear. In a slow procession, the trucks arrived and unloaded the women, already completely naked, near the stairs that led them to the gas chamber. From there, they were quickly pushed down. The camp's prisoners lived for 4 months in the shadow of the crematoria gates. It only took 10 days for 45,000 tormented bodies to pass through them and leave behind their souls. Over Camp C, whose fence had enclosed so many tragedies, a sepulchral silence fell. The last gassing in Birkenau took place in November of 1944. The Soviet army was approaching quickly, and the SS's nervousness grew proportionally. Every day, not only human lives burned in the crematoria, but also files, lists of names of the dead, indictments, and all types of documents. At the end of November, crematoria 2 and 3 were dismantled, and the selections continued to be carried out within the Sonderkommando ranks. Only about 100 detainees remained in the Special Commando, among them Müller, although without the slightest hope of survival, even more so because the source, if not of survival, at least of the prolongation of their lives, had also ended. The belongings of the dead that they managed to steal, and which they used to bribe and corrupt the SS. Even so, when it comes to survival, imagination knows no limits. The detainees began to fabricate false teeth filled with plaster and coated with copper that shone like gold, which allowed them to continue trading. On January 17th, the final roll call was held, gathering the 70,000 prisoners of Auschwitz, including Birkenau and Monowitz, who were still left. And the following day, the order for the camp's evacuation was given. 58,000 prisoners were led on a death march that would take them to the Mauthausen camp in Austria. Among them were many of the Sonderkommando survivors who managed to infiltrate. They were mostly Poles, with 25 Greeks and some Slovaks. During that march on foot in polar cold and later in an open wagon, many prisoners died or were shot. The Americans liberated Mauthausen on May 9th. Philipp Müller and Shlomo Venezia were among the few Sonderkommando who survived Auschwitz-Birkenau and the Death March. Venezia spent 7 years in hospitals due to the poor condition of his lungs. It took Venezia 47 years before he could speak about his experience in the camp. Only then was he able to tell his wife, with whom he had children. The secret remained within him. Like the memory of the camp, one never truly leaves the crematorium.